Greetings everyone, I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, this is going to be a video about blue-collar workers in cinema. This is going to be another Patreon request from my good buddy John, Zero Cool. Thank you for the request, buddy. I don't know when this video goes live if we have done it yet, but I know you do have plans for another collab with us, so can't wait for that, buddy. Now, blue-collar workers in cinema, and what do I think happened to this trope? Now, before I get into that, I think I probably, just for those who don't know the term, like I wasn't super familiar with the terms either, need to know what exactly a blue-collar worker is. Now, a blue-collar worker, to shorthand it, is someone who works in a field that somehow relates to manual work. There's a lot of area in there, but most of the examples I found include industrial work, construction, mining, handyman, anything that you're using your hand or physical labor in. Like something as simple as ditch digging or building a grave can be considered blue collar. And handyman. We are handymen. Like, for example, even though his main job that paid for the house that I currently live in was owning and operating a catering truck, after he retired, my grandfather, his side gig was a handyman and also working on cars. So you could say in his retirement he was blue collar, and also doing trees and stuff for our neighbors. And in that I did help him. Helped him with the trees, helped him do some other stuff. I mean, I'm the person that helped him build the carport that our Toyota Corolla is currently under. And he did pay me for it, so I did do some blue collar work, even though technically the work I engage in now would fall under a different collar thing. It would technically fall under gray collar, which is defined as not blue or white, stuff like airline pilots, clergy. I said firefighters and police, so I guess you could put security down under below that. But then the other term you hear people use a lot is white collar, which shorthanded is professional work like working desk, admin, so anything involving an office and all that would be considered white collar. For my line of work, it probably wouldn't go into white collar until you get into like management role, but even then it'd probably still be like a lighter shade of gray and not really full white. Then other terms are green collar, which are environmental work, pink collar, which I didn't even know that was a term, but I guess that's a term used for working in a field that is traditionally woman's work. Cleaning, nursing, teaching, childcare, stuff like that. Which I can understand why that term exists, but it's not really one you're going to use a lot of unless you're like doing an article, paper, video about the stigma against men working in them. As you know, that whole thing back in the day, people would lambast men for working in the nursing field. Now it's like who cares? Anyway, getting back on topic. Blue collar workers, manual labor. Now, some of the films that John gave as an example are the main ones I know about with blue collar workers. Jaws, Tremors, Leviathan, The Abyss, and I put down another one that I haven't seen all the way through, but I've seen parts of, and that's Men at Work, where we got the Sheen brothers as garbage men. Technically, they're working with their hands in there. And I threw this one in there as an example because it is true, even though not every film in this genre probably is going to fall into it, and that is traditional cowboy westerns. Because if you don't know a cowboy, which that term was originally an insult, we're essentially ranch hands. The ones that worked out there with the cows. So yeah, there'd be a lot of manual labor done in there. But this is a two-part question in with this video. What do I think of the films with them? And what do I think happened to them as, I guess you could say, a trope, or why they're not in cinema as often as they were. Now I'm going to start with the first half, which is what do I think of them? The examples he gave. I'm going to start with Tremors, because as a whole, that is probably my favorite film that primarily features blue-collar workers as the leads. Because in that one, we got Val and Earl as our leads. Two obvious blue-collar characters that from the beginning of the film, we can see they're blue-collar. I mean, we open up with Val just having drained the lizard, and he's going to wake up Earl. Stampede! Get out of the way! His dialogue is blue-collar. How many are required for a stampede, Earl? Is it 3 or more? Is there a minimum speed? Which, of course, that, among other films, has led to my sense of humor. Them doing work. And, of course, we are handy men. Working with a septic tank, saying no to free beer. amongst other stuff. They're very good characters. I mean, they are a little crass, I guess you could say, but that's part of their appeal. But they don't go overboard, and also there are times where they say something like when they're in front of our lead female character, Rhonda. I was forgetting her name there for a second, and they're like, "Pardon my French." Then of course she gets into it later. That's part of the humor there. Like, oh yeah, she's just like them. She might not fit every little tick on Val's list like that Bobby Lynn Dexter, but she is attractive in her own way, and she could be mentally stimulating, and of course he ends up liking her. And of course these two blue collar characters, part of the beauty of them being the leads is they're just average everymen out there, and all of a sudden they're put into this situation where they got to fight these giant subterranean worms that can drag you under. They got to figure out exactly how they move, how they find you, and then what to do to beat them. And of course they do. Can you fly, you sucker? You know, it just hit me on all Stampede. And of course the next sequel does kind of have some of that same vibe. I mean, we don't got Val anymore because Kevin Bacon was a huge star by this point, and I don't think they could get him back at that price. It would have been nice to see him back, but we don't have him. We still have Earl, and of course Michael Gross's character does come back as well, so we still got Burt Gummer. Burt's not really much of a blue collar character. We don't even know what he really does for work other than, you know, collect a lot of guns and in later parts being the survivalist thing. So I guess once he gets to be a survivalist, you can kind of call him blue collar. But it's like a different type of blue, different shade, as it were. But we still have Earl. He's doing ranch work by that time, so he's still blue collar, but it's for himself. And of course, the whole thing with Wildfire, the ostriches, which, and I know in World there's supposed to be a male and a female, but if you look at it from an outside thing, it's like, Earl, I hate to tell you, but your plan's not going to work. Those are both male ostriches. Just thought you ought to know. And then, of course, unlike the first film where he's put into the middle of a situation where it's like, from the get-go, at first he's like, all right, I'll do it for the money. We got this, to use a phrase from a certain zombie movie. We got this by the ass. And then that rug is beautifully dragged out from underneath him when the worms turn. And then they got to figure everything out again like they did in the first one. It's a whole new ball game. Worms never cut you any slack. And of course leads to a great finale like the first one. Third one, Bird a little bit. It doesn't have as high budget and is definitely a backdoor pilot for the TV series that followed, which I will review episode by episode one of these days. But it still does have some of that other thing. And I haven't really watched the last couple sequels yet. I mean, I watched the first one they did after 4, but it's been a couple years. I don't remember much about it other than liking the design for the African graboid. Similar but different. Jaws. Jaws, really the only blue-collar characters in that one that would be traditional are... dang it, I'm sorry I didn't put them in the notes, but Quint and Hooper. Now, Hooper is an interesting character because he comes from a white-collar background with his family and the degree and all that, but he does like doing blue-collar work when he's out at sea, which is part of the issue that arrives with Quint, because Quint is traditionally blue-collar when it comes to being out there, working the sea, killing sharks and all that. And you can tell right away he doesn't like Hooper. That's where their animosity comes from. You know, he's like giving me hands, like, doesn't really have a lot of callous. That whole thing of like, oh yeah, you're not really all that. Nice little thing there to have that little bit of dichotomy, but the thing is, Quint does respect Hooper enough once they're out at sea because he knows what he's doing. That, you know, he puts him in charge of driving the boat, in charge of doing all the stuff, you know, messes with him like when he's playing solitaire. Quit playing with yourself, Hooper! And then, of course, the sheriff. The sheriff, like I said, is more gray collar than he is blue collar. But once he gets out at sea, he does start engaging in the blue collar work. So, yeah, it does count. But it's a different type of thing where he's definitely not in his element, especially when you add in the fact he doesn't like being out in the water. He's mainly there because we got to kill this shark. And they're nice characters, all they're back and forth having to figure out the situation. Of course, Quint screws everybody by destroying the radio, and then the water gets into the engine, and like, oh, they're screwed. And, you know, just like in Tremors, they got to figure out a way out of their situation. The only difference is instead of being stuck on a rock with things out of the ground circling, you're stuck in the ocean with a shark. and he keeps coming back for his noon feeding, as Hooper puts it. But they eventually do win, smile, you son of a... And they kill the shark. And of course, we lose Quint. He dies in both the book and in the movie, but I think his death is a lot more gruesome in the movie because he actually gets eaten, whereas in the book he gets pulled down by a harpoon and drowned. Not as gruesome. And of course, since the whole Indianapolis thing is unique to the movie, it is kind of fitting there. He survives one massive shark attack like that, only to die at the teeth of another shark. Then Leviathan, they're all working underwater, doing their mine work. So they're all blue collar. And they all talk, blue collar work, talk. Then they're put into a situation where like, crap. We got to deal with these dang Russians and their experiments. It's like Alien meets the thing. And Alien, that's another film where they're essentially blue collar workers because they're truck drivers in space, and their conversations. We got to discuss the bonus situation. Both Alien and Leviathan, it's just everyday people doing the work. All of a sudden, they're put into a situation where they don't know how to handle it. They got to figure it out. People say you can get picked out one by one, and then some people survive. The only difference is, whereas Alien ends on that hopeful note, Leviathan does kind of end on a hopeful note. I mean, one character dies one more time, but then one character working for the company you've loved to hate, you actually get that satisfying thing where Peter Weller is like, a lot better. Whereas in Alien, the closest we get to that is when they burn Ash after they've knocked his head off, when we find out that the one who has been really shilling for following stuff in order to keep the company's bottom line is a robot. He's a robot. And of course, men at work, they're garbage men. I haven't seen the whole film, and the parts I've seen I haven't seen in a while, but they're literally working with their hands, working with all that trash. And then, of course, getting into the traditional cowboy films where they're dealing with it. They're out working in the ranch. What happens around them is going to depend on the film, but they're thrown into a situation they got to figure it out of. And that seems to be the one common thread with a lot of these films involving blue-collar working characters as the leads, is that they're thrown into a situation that they don't quite understand. They got to figure something out to a degree, like the ones with the supernatural or sci-fi leaning. It's a creature or some type of experiment that they're just thrown into, like, dang, and they got to figure it out as people are picked off. Whereas the more traditional ones like westerns, it's usually more like, someone with a land scheme, someone trying to put one side against another, someone trying to exploit the natives. It's going to vary, but they're thrown into a situation where they got to figure something out, and then they go through it. Or it could be something like The Magnificent Seven, where it's a working class town, and they got to call in some men who deal in lead in order to save the town. And you can transfer that little thing like that to other cultures as well. But more familiar with American cinema, so with that. And as you can tell from how I've been talking about a lot of these films enthusiastically, I actually do like a lot of these films with characters. You could throw in dozens of other examples. There's literally a film called Blue Collar. But just from those ones, you can tell I do like them. I do like having the everyman in there, especially when they're thrown into a situation they don't know how to deal with. Now, what do I think happened to them? Now, I think using them in the front of something like a sci-fi thing like that, I think it did kind of run its course in its first run. Because think about it. Most of those films I brought up, I haven't really mentioned The Abyss, but that's because even though I think I have it up here somewhere, or maybe it's in the back. And by the way, I have both cuts on VHS, so if I watch it, I'll probably do separate videos on it, like a full-on one about what I think of the film. Maybe I'll just save that for a video essay, and then at the end do my thoughts on the different endings. But I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it. Other than I can see why that's the one that got all the critical acclaim, because it's James Cameron. And at that point in his career, as he started to take off, the critics are like, "We're not worthy." Of course, they were more like that when it came to Titanic. "We are not worthy." And then they lost some of that luster with Avatar. Or as Arnold said, Abada. Abada. Now, but what do I think happened to him? Like I said, run its course, because most of those were in the late 70s to early 90s. Now, Some of them did continue after that, and we still did have blue collar characters in cinema. I mean, haven't seen it in ages, but I think like City Slickers, you kind of involve it because you're working on a ranch. And we do see them from time to time, like in that movie they did about that mining accident a couple years ago, and that one about the roughnecking oil drilling off the coast that they did. And I guess you could say A Perfect Storm is about blue collar because they are trolling for fish. And a little bit after this, technically to a degree, Forrest Gump is a blue collar character, but he shifts between what collar he's wearing depending on what job he's doing. But like when he's doing the shrimping boat, he's a blue collar character. There's another one, he's a good one there. He's not really thrown into a big mess like some of the other ones are when he's doing the shrimping. It's more when he was in the military that he had to do that. I'll do a separate video for my thoughts on that because that deserves its whole individual review. But running their course like that, where we had so many back to back, is what I think happened, and that's something you see in cinema a lot when you look through the history from even a little. It's a little bit less when you look at the silent era, but once you get into the talkies and go through to modern, you notice the waves. Like think about it. We're gonna bring up westerns again. Westerns were very popular from the 50s into the early 70s. You still get westerns after that and into the 80s, but you wouldn't see them as prolific. I mean, how many shows like Gunsmoke and all that were still made then? The only one I could think of is Lonesome Dove. And even now, westerns aren't really made that often. When was the last big western film that was made that was actually a critical and financial success? The last one I could think of was True Grit. I know they did that Magnificent Seven remake, but was that really critically and financially successful? Financially, maybe, but I don't know if it was critically successful. I haven't seen it all the way through, but that's because I didn't want to watch it first and then go back and watch the other one and then be like, maybe I probably shouldn't have. But that's another day, another video with that one. We still do get blue collar characters in films, but I think most of the time now it's when they adapt real life events, like said accident that I just mentioned, or they're minor characters. They're not really the lead, which I think is kind of a shame because I do like the everyman character thrown into a situation they can't handle. Now, part of the reason that we don't get them as the lead is back to the whole thing. To steal a professional wrestling line that people like Jim Ross always use, the nature of the business is cyclical. Is that we'll have all these specific genre things be popular, like I just mentioned with westerns, but to go to the time a lot of these were popular, and this ties in a little bit with Leviathan, Tremors, and Jaws directly, because they are kind of horror films at their core. And Alien more so, because Alien, you can make the argument, is essentially a slasher film set in outer space with a alien instead of a slasher killer, but just on a bigger budget with an A-list director. But in that time, we had slasher films. They were popular, made all throughout the 80s. You still had a couple into the 90s, but the genre ran its course. Nowadays, you'll get a couple throwbacks every now and then, but it's like few and far between. Like you had Behind the Mask. I don't think Trick or Treat's really a slasher film, but then you had that one. Dang it, I forget the title of it off the top of my head. It's the one with the baby mask. I've only seen the first one. I haven't seen the second one yet. I did like the first one, but it was one of those ones like, really? We have to do a sequel to this now? But you go back further, you see a lot of them. The early 30s into the mid 40s, that's when the heyday of the golden age of monster films was. We got Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman, The Mummy. I mean, it was in two waves and that little break in between, but they were still there. And of course, you can notice the change in thought of how to make them in between the two schools, especially in the second wave when it started to become more about than it was really about the art, especially with the mummy films. The devil's on the loose and he's dancing with the mummy. Guess you could say that character is a blue collar character too. 50s, all the sci-fi films involving aliens, giant creatures made from radioactivity like Them. Day the Earth Stood Still, the original The Thing. Which is an aside, I guess you could also say that the characters in John Carpenter's remake of The Thing are blue collar. I mean, they're there for scientific studies, so they're doing A-collar work, but they're doing it while doing blue collar work. They're also good there too. Although that film didn't make as much money when it first came out, but that's for a whole other thing, Stupid critics. The pornographer of violence. Oh, you. Into the 70s, you had a lot of disaster movies. And that ran its course. Of course, they came back in the 90s, but, you know, sometimes they'll come back. Like I said, cyclical. 80s, already mentioned, was Slasher, but he also had some other stuff in that decade, but that's the big one there. 90s, trope, you know, they brought back disaster movies. You'd also have some teen comedies, but you've always had teen comedies. It seems like they come in spurts, like late 70s into the 80s. 90s, you get some more. Of course, you also had a different type of teen comedy because that was the grunge era. You got movies like Clerks, too, even though that's not really a teen comedy, but it's one that everybody could work for. That one's more of a white-collar comedy, though. And then in the 2000s, even though it started before that, that's when we started to get the rise of the modern superhero film, but it came in two waves, where it was all the standalone ones. And then in 2008, a little film called Iron Man came out, and that's where we get our modern thing, where it's not just fully about superhero films, but it's about cinematic universes. I mean, we have the MCU, the DCEU, the MonsterVerse, the DOA Dark Universe, amongst others. Even though all this ignores the first big universe like that, it's like it forgets the Stephen King universe, even though that's more so with his novels than it is on film, because it's kind of hard to do that on a film, at least to the same degree, when a lot of these films are made by different studios. Like I've pointed out, like that sheriff that gets killed in Cujo, that's supposed to be the same sheriff from The Dead Zone, but played by two different characters. And unless you read the books, you probably wouldn't even notice that, unless you're like, oh, wait a minute, isn't that the same name? Of course, in the book, you get the inner monologue, and it's like sad to see this character we saw that helped the Christopher Walken character get killed in such a manner, but that's life. That's what people say. You keep it riding high, and then boom. But back on topic, because of how everything's built around cinematic universes now, I think that's why we don't see as many blue-collar characters as the leads, unless it's something like adapting a true story, adapting a novel as like a little independent film, or in one of the big films where they're a side character. Because how many, I'm going to use comic book characters as an example, how many start off as blue-collar characters that are put into a situation they don't know? I mean, there probably could be a couple, but they're probably more the obscure ones, because I can't really think of many off the top of my head. Iron Man, I mean, he was put into a situation at first, but he's not really blue-collar. Thor isn't blue-collar, even though he does technically work with his hands, but he works more with a hammer, but it's not the type of hammer that blue-collar workers would be able to use. Captain America, not really blue-collar. I guess you would throw that more under gray if you put it under anything, even though technically speaking, his outfit does literally have a blue collar. But it's not the type of blue collar we're talking about. A lot of the other ones that deal with spy work and all that, that's more, I mean, probably more gray collar. At DC, a couple of them will be white collar. But even when you go into the MonsterVerse, most of the main characters will be white collar, like Dr. Serizawa, white collar. The mother character, the dad character from the second Godzilla film, white collar. I mean, even the leads in Godzilla vs. Kong, they're white collar. I mean, the only time you'd be probably able to put a blue-collar worker in there is maybe if they worked with Kong and all that on the ground, but even then they'd be working for white-collar people. Even in Kong's solo film, most of those you'd say would be gray or white-collar. Not a lot of room. It's like, depending on the circumstances, you can't really work one in, which is a shame, because it'd be nice to throw one in, but you gotta think it's like, okay, does it make sense for the plot? And that's the big thing right there. Is like sometimes it doesn't really make sense for the plot, which is a shame. But I'd love to see them actually include more of these blue-collar characters if they could figure out a way to make it make sense for the plot. Because I love these ones being thrown into a situation they don't understand, and then, crap. Like, even though the last couple of attempts haven't been as good, I'd love to see a Predator film if they could do it right, do that. Because, think about it. First Predator film, it was gray-collar characters because it's military people. Second one, also gray-collar characters, but borders a little bit more on the blue-collar-esque because, you know, he's a street cop. Third one, I guess you could say a couple of them might have been blue-collar, but they were more white-collar. We don't know what type of color they were. And, of course, a couple gray-collar. And the last one, all white collar, but I haven't seen it. And from what I hear, it's probably going to annoy me a little bit when I do. But maybe there'll be a rant for my monster thing this year. But it'd be interesting. The only downside is a blue collar character probably get killed by a predator quickly unless they're able to adapt pretty well. Like maybe they're former military, but now they're blue collar, and they just adapt. But then you'd have that thing of where they're a blue collar that used to be a gray collar. But, do another modern day monster film. I guess you could say like Independence Day that maybe Jeff Goldblum might be blue collar, but I'd say he's more white collar. That just popped to mind. And of course Will Smith is gray collar, but they kind of have those same tendencies. They're there. And of course the day is saved technically by a blue collar character. In the words of my generation, boys, I'm back. Of course, but he's a minor side character there. Not really one of the leads. You just gotta figure out a way to include them in a way to where they make sense, logical, and most importantly, the story is entertaining and the actor is engaging and you like the character. Because if they're the lead but they're unlikable, not going to be as much. Because that's the thing with a lot of the other characters. You like them. You like Peter Weller. You like Val and Earl. You like Hooper, the sheriff, and Quentin and their back and forth. You like them. And even from what little I've seen, you like the Sheen brothers working as garbage men on garbage day. But if you put them in there and then you just don't like them, it's like, what's the point? What's the point of all of it? And like I said, it's cyclical, so hopefully once this whole cinematic universe craze starts to run its course, which probably won't be for a while since Marvel's now starting to do its second wave. I know there's been some mixed things about some of the shows, but with how Loki ended, I'm not going to get into it in this video because that's for its own separate video as well. I could kind of see where they're going to be going in with the next couple films now. Probably not going to be for a while, at least with them. DC, I haven't seen their last couple films, so hopefully in the realm of the more mid films or the lesser known ones, we start to see more blue collar characters pop up. Because it's about that time where we should be starting to get some more throwback-esque films like we do every so often. I mean, in the 80s, we got those films that were a throwback to films of the 50s, so we should be getting throwbacks to the late 80s, early 90s pretty soon. So who knows? Maybe we'll get some more characters in the vein of Val and Earl pretty soon. One can wish. One can wish.